Next, we're going to speak about network event logging. So we want a network device to generate a log message for various reasons. If the device has any kind of failure, like if the attack server failed, we would want a log message. If it's slow, if it's what else? If an interface failed, we want a log message. If the device is low on memory and CPU is overloaded, likewise, we would want a log message. If we don't use CCNP to get alerted, we may prefer a syslog for that. If traffic's going through that device violates security policies, which means ACL logging, we would want to get a log message, because it can be, as I stated, either a user which tries to get access to unauthorized resources, which that's not good either. But worse that what that can be, it could be an infected endpoint which tries to discover the network. Also, when a firewall builds, tears down, or drops a session, we would want to get notified, because as I stated, we want to know what happened in the network. What traffic was allowed, when was the session started, when was the session teared down, and if the traffic was dropped, which means the session was not allowed. Because all that information, we can use that data to make a, let's say, to learn network behavior, to see what is a baseline of a functional and healthy network. So then when we can see suspicious traffic, unusual traffic, it means that there's something wrong in there. So logging is useful for network telemetry and forensics analysis. Like if an incident happened, I'm going to go to the logs and try to analyze to see from where did the attack start, what was the first victim, then from that victim, where did it spread out to. So I'm doing that to better understand how was that possible. What was the mistake in our, let's say, security implementation that allowed that attacker to, to infect an endpoint, and then that endpoint to infect other endpoints and data to be leaked. So that's forensics analysis. After the event has happened, we have to understand why it had happened to prevent it from happening again in the future. Security auditing and troubleshooting, which means, like for example, debugging, for example. So if something is wrong on the device, so security auditing means like ACL logging to see what the users are doing in the network, or firewall logging when a firewall sends, allows, or drops a session. And also for troubleshooting purposes, if there's a problem on any network device and you have to investigate that, you're gonna go debug, which means you're gonna log a lot of messages back and forth to investigate the debug output to try to understand what the actual problem is. And also, most importantly nowadays, it's useful for indication of compromise. Of course, logging helps a bit in here, but not that much. But of course, it's a useful component which allows me to have the indication of compromise in the file or attack trajectory, which as I stated before. So indication of compromise means that I believe something was compromised, was infected an endpoint. And file or device trajectory means that once server A was infected, I want to know what traffic has server A sent in the network, who does server A speak to. Because if it speaks to PCB and PCA, chances are that also PCA and PCB got infected as well. So that's the file trajectory or device trajectory to see exactly what happened. So who started the attack, what got infected first, and then what other devices got possibly infected based on the traffic flow in the network. Now iOS and ASA, when ASA and iOS are going to generate a log message, because for example an ACL has matched the logging keyword, that log message can be replicated in multiple places. So the fact that the iOS or the ASA traffic has matched an ACL with the logging with the log keyword, or on the ASA it's built in. Let's say the iOS. Let's say the iOS on the iOS traffic has matched an entry with the log keyword. It's going to generate the log message. Now that message, which is one message, can be replicated, the same message, to multiple destinations. It can be the iOS or the SA can present that message at the console, at the VTI lines, which means for SSH or Telnet sessions, in the buffer, which the buffer is a circular limited memory space. So once the buffer is going to be, let's say, fully used, is gonna start deleting the earliest entries in the buffer. We can the iOS or the SA can send that message to a remote logging server, which means via syslog, or they can convert SNMP traps into logging. So I can choose to have an SNMP trap, like an interface going down. Instead of sending it as an SNMP trap to an SNMP server, I can convert that trap into a logging message and send it to whatever I want. So the same unique log message can at the same time be replicated or presented in multiple places. Now the SA has additional logging capabilities. Can also log that message at the SDM, because you would want to, for example, to go in SDM and see what happens through the SA. You can also, of course, do a lot of filtering. I'm going to show you that in a couple. And also via email. The SDM can choose to send a log message via email. Like, for example, you may choose to configure the SA so that when your ISP, yes, let's say you have two ISPs, A and B, and when the ISP A link goes down, then you would want the SA to log a message and email you so you know that the connection is down, for example. So SA has additional logging capabilities as opposed to iOS. Now each log message has a severity level associated, which let's say the higher the severity level, like 7, it means more data is going to be presented in that log message. And of course, each possible log message that a device can generate is going to have an associated level, which of course emergencies means that probably the iOS or DSS are going to send a log message with a level of 0 only in case of emergencies. Like, for example, I don't know, the CPU goes high. I don't know exactly which messages are associated with each severity level in there. So 0 is emergencies, 1 is alerts, 2 is critical, 3 is errors, 4 is warnings, 5 notifications, 6 informational, 7 debugging. Now, like best practices, or let's say implementation wise, in general, console logging should be disabled or configured at a lower severity level, like never debugging, or not even information in some cases, because extensive console logging can overload the CPU. Because let me ask you something, when do you want access at the console nowadays? Except, for example, of course, the fact that some companies, for security reasons, they have out-of-band management to the console, to those devices. But in general, you go to the console at the device when something is very bad, right? Otherwise, you manage the device remotely. So because of that reason, that usually you go at the console if something is truly bad with that device, you cannot reach it via other means. It means that if you do a debug on the router and the console logging level is going to be debugging level, then that device is going to give priority to the debugging and to the logging functions, and it's going to give less priority to everything else, including any kind of control plane protocols. So it's going to give like top priority to being able to log the messages and to show the output at the console, because that's top priority at that point, because that's why you are at the console, because something is pretty bad. So you can imagine if you leave the console at debugging level configured and somebody goes on a device and enables debugging, if the output is too much, it's going to clearly instantly overload the CPU of the device. It's going to go high CPU, it may even crash, or even without crashing, it's going to stay high CPU, which means it's not going to have time to properly process other control plane packets like IGP, BGP, ARP, which means the device is you're going to have intermittent network connectivity through that device in there, which is not something that you want. VTI and buffer logging is useful for troubleshooting purposes because in general you would go at the VTI or when you telnet or SSH to the device, you're going to perform some kind of debugging in there. So you want to look in the log messages to see what traffic was allowed to the SA firewall. So that's why it's useful. But of course, if you want to see the debug messages at the VTI lines, it means that the VTI lines have to be configured for level 7 severity level of logging. And we can use, of course, ideally you should use multiple remote logging destinations. What I'm saying, and what I mean in here, multiple remote syslog servers, because you would want, because on the device, all log messages logged at the console or the VTI lines are gone, are temporarily kept in there, while in the buffer, of course, are kept as long as the buffer can sustain the amount of logging. So that's not consistent, because if you want to analyze like 2 weeks later what happened in the network, the logs are gone from the device. So ideally you should use multiple remote syslog servers for redundancy multiple and for log retention, because a syslog server is going to keep, of course, depending on what a how much storage it has, is going to keep the log message in there indefinitely based on your company's policy. Now, before we move on, just to make sure everybody understood what I was saying in here with those options. So if you take the network device, one network device in there, and let's say a log message is generated. A log message is generated. So log message is generated. And let's say it has a severity level of 5. Now, what network device is going to do is that it's going to look, okay, do I have logging enabled? Assuming I have it enabled, then it's going to take a look at which destinations do I have logging enabled. And let's say that in my case, I have logging enabled in the following places. At the console with a level of 6, at the VTI lines with a level of 4, in the buffer with a level of 4, and at a syslog server with a level of 7. It means that log message is going to get replicated only at the console, which has a higher level of logging configured. 6 is higher than 5. And at the syslog server, which uses 7. But that message doesn't get replicated to the VTI lines or to the buffer, because those are configured to receive log messages at a severity level of 4, which is lower than the severity level of the log message. Now, what is syslog? It's nothing else but system logging, which means logging to a remote system, which is going to be the centralized server. And by default, logs are being sent over UDP 514 by default, which, because it's over UDP and it's not reliable, so the server is not going to acknowledge the receipt of a logging message. For security reasons, if you want the logging messages if you want to make sure that the network device's log message has been received by the syslog server, then you can option use TCP, so that the server is going to acknowledge having received the log message from the network device. Now, configuration wise, you enable logging. It has to be enabled, logging on, logging enabled. You configure logging destinations. So you choose to which destinations do you want the log message to show up. You say at the console level, what is the severity level I want logging message to show up? At the VTI lines, at the buffer, at the syslog server, and so on. And optionally, you can configure logging filtering, which means you can specify which log messages, severity and type, are logged where. It may seem like it's an overlap with what I stated before, but it's not. So given this use case, it means that that message of a level of 5 is not going to reach the VTI lines or the buffer because they have been configured for a lower severity level. But what you can do in here we can do filtering. In this box in the middle, you can do message filtering. Log message filtering. And because each log message not only has a severity level associated, but also a number associated. Each log message has an associated number. You may choose to do log filtering. So let's say that log message has a number of 25. You may configure logging filtering so that a message of 25, which means that your ISP is down, for example, can only be sent to the syslog server. So even though technically speaking, the severity level of 5 could be sent to the console, which uses 6, you've configured logging filtering there in the middle between those two boxes, between the logging message and destinations. You've configured filtering, which doesn't allow that specific message to be sent at the console. So that's enhancement of syslog, of logging in there.